The legitimacy of criminal justice system is what gives people the reason to obey the law, because they believe that it is grounded in fair and principled delivery of justice. The problem with this motion is that the moment that punishment becomes exchangeable for any bodily risk that you have, the system stops looking like a neutral institution of justice and starts looking like a state that uses human desperation as a tool. At this point in this debate, they still haven't responded. Why do we need to be this desperate? Because we have clearly pointed out that there's no urgent medical problem that necessitates this. There are other alternatives who can do the same action. This is not a THBT debate. This is a THW. You need to be more specific with your policy on why we need to do this in the very first place. Few responses. First, OG tries to say that this is safe. Like, even big pharma doing all these trials literally cannot account for far end off the curve where bad things happen. OG is assertive, and even if the things are safe, this literally can have side effect. But the problem is, OG squirrels this motion because they have to defend the wording of the quote-unquote hazardous effects as stated within the motion in itself. Second, OG is overly utilitarian. Take an example of their language. They say that these prisoners are useless, but the problem is this doesn't just apply to those prisoners who are placed within this prison systems because they're really bad, for example, or maybe they're really sure that they have convicted the right person. The problem is it also applies to other individuals who are desperate to get out because prison system in itself is very bad within the status quo. That's why you have less and less incentive to improve the systems when you reward people to maybe get the benefit of them being placed into these medical trials in the very first place. So this does not respond to Joseph's principled push on rehabilitation, which is a core tenet of criminal justice system and the reason why we have them in the very first place. Let's weigh the risk. We are fine with drug development being slower because the end does not justify the means here. And third, side government cannot take their cake and eat it too. The fact that the case of OG only flies in the best case unlocks the harm that Joseph talks about. The nature of medical technology and drug development that we have, no idea what the long-term harms are. This can manifest in the 10 to 30 years after the procedure. This is an affront to their rights and dignity. Even if they are convicted, they still have to retain their own human dignity and they still have their own rights. So the problem with the case of Gov is it's simply out of the real context, right? They say that, it's okay because it's going to be applied to bad people, like murderers, for example. But the problem is, Joseph already pointed out that if they're placed in reclusion perpetua or life imprisonment, which are non-reductible, this doesn't apply to them. That's why even if you have mechanisms that Joseph mentioned, like plea deal and reduction of sentence with good behavior, these criminals aren't provided with the same leniency within the status quo due to the barriers of the judicial account on how we deal with these grave offenses. But even if you try to extend this to the same offenders anyway, that only makes this kind of situation worse. Here are the flips. First, these individuals are placed within the prison system precisely because the legal system has determined that they pose a grave threat or grave danger to our society. So reducing their sentence in exchange for like experimentation that we don't really know why do we need this in the first place means that the state is no longer prioritizing justice or protection for their community. But the problem is you're just providing a lot of utility for what? Like, literally, what's the necessity of this? Second, the perspective of victims. Like, this feels like a profound betrayal for every constituent that you have for that state. The state is effectively saying that the suffering inflicted on them can now be discounted because the offender has made themselves medically useful. Like, for example, if you're a rape victim, the early release of your abuser would not feel like rehabilitation or fairness. That will make you hate the criminal justice even more because it would feel like the state has converted your own trauma into something negotiable for their own means. This is why we say that this is a bastardization of justice system in which we say is impermissible. A second chance should not be given in this form because the issue is not whether rehabilitation is possible, but whether the state should allow dangerous offender to shorten punishment for a transaction unrelated to justice, remorse, and genuine reform that we say is important principle in this debate. So where does this debate actually apply? And how does this answer to the claim of consent? Because for some reason, they just accuse us of being uncharitable without explaining what the fuck is the MEC. At best, it applies to offenders who are considered serious enough, let's say, to be imprisoned but not serious enough to receive life imprisonment. Yet, even with that category, the problem is that the coercive structure of the offer does not distinguish the quote-unquote truly dangerous at what they have mentioned and everyone else who are trapped in the prison. So if a person ends up in the criminal justice system through wrongful conviction or because they have committed survival-driven offense like theft for sustenance, for example, these are the same exact pressure that still bears onto them. No matter how informed they are fucking desperate to get out because the prison systems right now are so coercive. And one, it operates in a gang-related structure. Like, for example, if you don't have any protection within the systems, you're going to be shunked. You're going to be stabbed, for instance. And those are the abuses that you don't want to fix. That's why you don't want to have. That's why you want to get out.
POI.
But before that, POI from CO. POI from CG.
Yeah, so mechanisms for reduction of sentences already exist in the status quo. It's just a better mechanism that we're offering. Kindly engage.
The problem is that you need to fucking outcompete all of these other mechanisms. Like, for example, you need to reduce a lot in comparison to other mechanisms like plea deal, for instance. You need to reduce a lot in comparison to the other mechanisms of like being released early on due to good behavior. The problem is that that kind of out-competitive mechanism allows you to unlock all of the harms that we have mentioned. The fact that you will reduce their years for like 8 years, for instance, in comparison to 4 years to other mechanisms available because you think that it's so urgent. But the problem is it's not. So the problem is you unlock graver harms, for instance, and the very, very distinction on that is that one, you're released for good behavior. That means you're no longer a threat for the society. That's why the justice system views you as someone who is a free man, or you can be released early on. And the problem is in your side, you will rely on this what? You are medically useful. That's not a real condition. That doesn't prove why you will not rape any children anymore in your side of the house. That's why consent is flushed out on Gulf's side, and also the claim of deterrence in their side doesn't really exist. Next big flip. They say that, yeah, sentence reduction would have to be substantial or big because otherwise there's no real reason for prisoners to accept severe physical threats attached to dangerous experimentation. That's the second response to that POI. So that matters because the incentive must not only be attractive on its own, but also strong enough to outcompete other existing routes. So, one, again, the state has no moral right to trade freedom for bodily endangerment. And two, conviction in itself does not erase human dignity. You still have the right to retain your own self, and you have the right to push the state to improve the means of this prison system and other means available for you. Because again, you still have other pathways available. Where do we really fucking need this? There's no specific launch from Gulf. We have other medical alternatives. Very proud to oppose.